Welcome everyone to our Glasscock book chat. I'm Emily Brady. I'm director of the Glasscock Center. I know most of you, but for those of you who don't know me. And this series, which we started, I guess, a couple of years ago, offers an opportunity to hear faculty in affiliated programs to the Glasscock Center discussing their recently published books. And today we have two authors presenting two books, so it's a kind of bonus session. They'll be discussing each other's books after giving introductions to them. So let me introduce Dr. James Ball and Dr. Leonardo Cardoso. Dr. Ball is an assistant professor in the Department of Performance Studies. His work looks at the politics of performance and the performance of politics, analyzing both the theatrical structures that underwrite political events and aesthetic performances that intervene in political processes. Leonardo Cardoso is also an assistant professor in the Department of Performance Studies and I believe still a Crawley faculty fellow. His work, in the past perhaps, his work explores sound making and auditory practices as avenues for studying the government. All right, over to you. Welcome.
Welcome, thank you. Dr. Cardoso may no longer be a Crawley faculty fellow, but in fact, I am a Crawley faculty fellow.
Ah, excellent.
One Crawley faculty fellow on this book chat. I think, Leah, we decided that I would start first to introduce my book, and then we'll pass on to you. Does that work? Great. So thank you all for having us here. I'm very excited to talk a little bit about my book, Theater of State, A Dramaturgy of the United Nations. As you'll hear from Leo as well in a moment, both of these books came out of our graduate school work. So for me, like the genesis of this book dates back to reading J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words for the first time as a first semester master's student in 2006. A kind of one of those epiphany reading moments that gets the gears moving, thinking about political performance, the performativity of politics, and then from that, on to thinking about diplomacy. The 2006, of course, is the height of the Iraq War, a period in which diplomacy had been increasingly devalued in this country. And so I took a sort of a sense of urgency for the project precisely from my political commitments in that period. I had been, before entering grad school, I had been making theater in New York City and had, it was always politically engaged, more or less. In 2004, when the RNC was in New York City, I was staging, productions that were trying to be in conversation with the political moment right there, a few blocks away. But of course, in grad school, then other concerns take the fore. There's other things that you need to do. And being in New York City, the UN, the United Nations, presented itself as a really available site in which to locate this work and to investigate performance and diplomacy. I ended up working with an NGO that reported on the work of the UN Security Council, named Security Council Report, easily enough. And that was really my entry into the field in a lot of ways, was writing reports with them, eventually being accredited as a journalist through them to the United Nations, and sitting in on meetings and meeting with first secretaries and other diplomats and so on to talk to them about their work and what was going on. At the same time, in that period, the UN had this massive archive that had become available online, both in terms of a textual archive that you could find all the transcripts and so on of their events, but also they had begun live streaming a lot of their almost all of their meetings, and these live streams had remained sort of accumulated as an archive going back to the early 2000s, and so these things became the centerpiece of my field work, as well as a brief period that I spent in The Hague attending proceedings of the International Criminal Court, watching trials there. So yeah, the book fits into the discipline of performance studies in terms of, as I think in my bio, I talk about my interest in the politics of performance on the one hand and the performance of politics on the other, thinking both about how politics makes its way into aesthetic, into art, and then also the artfulness of our political world, right? And the art of doing things like diplomacy. Now, in performance studies, that second one, kind of the use of performance as a political tool, is often gestured at and invoked, but it's not always. Sometimes it's very rigorously investigated, but it's a bit more rare to see that side of things. And that's what I was interested in investigating here, bringing those two sides together, if you will. The other thing that kind of drove me in this work was kind of being opposed to pejorative invocations of theater and theatricality. So, so often when people talk about the theater and diplomacy, it's to denigrate it, right? To say that it's empty show. In politics as well, right? Theater is invoked as a marker of falsehood, dissembling, lying, or of some sort of like excessive spectacle that is not healthy. And quite the opposite. I take theater to be like the heart of the work of politics, of diplomacy. I don't think that we can have democracy without theater, frankly. So I'm deeply invested in the theatricality of politics in this book and beyond. So, but that's the book is ultimately, my book is ultimately about spectatorship. The other way that theater and diplomacy often come together is in discussions of things like body language or of those sort of nonverbal cues, this notion that we could kind of read what a politician is saying or thinking or doing other than just in their words. And that's an approach that I'm also kind of skeptical of. I'm kind of suspicious to any sort of guide to the nonverbal that we might have via performance. Rather, this book is kind of about how power is exercised via spectatorship, that is, by watching, both how institutions watch the world, how powerful interests watch the world, and how we watch the spectacle of global politics play out, and in watching, kind of exercise our own agency, power, force on the world stage. And so the theater of state in my title is precisely this sort of arrangement of viewing positions, if you will. The institution that looks at the world, the individual nation or state that has their own perspective, and then the global citizen emplaced as a spectator to global politics with their own role to play. I think that's enough to kind of give a brief overview of the investments in the book. Leo, tell us about sound politics in Sao Paulo.
All right, you can hear me, right? Thanks, Jim, and thank you all for coming. So this is a bit unusual, talk about two books, and part of the challenge is introducing your own book in 5-10 minutes, and then part of the challenge is to find some of the common issues and challenges that we had as scholars studying institutions that are controlled and that produce a really large amount of bureaucracy and protocols. So I think we can talk a little bit about that later. So I think a good idea perhaps is to just tell you where I'm coming from or what I was thinking when I decided to write this book, and then some of the approaches that I propose in the book. And I would say that the book is, in terms of the main argument or contribution, I think it's more methodological than theoretical, I would say. The method is, how can you take something like noise to understand the state? And inversely, so how can you take the state to understand sound, how sound is, how people hear sound, right? And I think it relates to what Jim was saying about politics and performance. So I think it's a nice parallel there. So basically, I'm coming from ethnomusicology. If you haven't heard of ethnomusicology, is basically a discipline that established in the 50s and mostly coming from cultural anthropology. And establishing kind of distinction from musicology, right? So you have the ethno in front of it, which has been debated for decades. Should we have the ethno in front of it, or should we just get rid of the ethno because it's just musicology? But anyways, finished my dissertation, and the book is coming from my dissertation in this field. And when I was a graduate student, I would say that you had two expectations as a graduate student. One expectation was you should conduct fieldwork in the global South. So you should go to South Asia, you should go to Latin America to conduct your research. There was, especially as a Brazilian, there was I would say, a lot of expectation that you would go to Brazil to do your research. The second expectation is that you would create a kind of a cultural approach to music. And I remember there was this infinite discussion of music in culture, music as culture, and then they kept exchanging those terms. But what I mean by the cultural approach is usually going to talk about a genre. So you would probably talk about popular music because classical music is something that the boring musicologists do, and you don't want to get close to the musicologists. So popular music, you talk about a genre, you talk about a community, or you talk about kind of a music as a national symbol. So you have dozens of dissertations about tango as a national symbol, samba as a national symbol. And I'm telling you that because I was really not interested in doing any of that. I thought there was a kind of a saturation of that kind of research already in the 2000s. I decided to approach the topic a little differently. And, I'm coming from UT Austin, and in Austin, as you know, in the 2000s and 2010s, it was going through a really, I would say, aggressive gentrification, and probably still is. But at that point, it was really visible. If you live in the East Campus, you could definitely see the nice apartments kind of pushing some of the Hispanic communities further south or further east. But there was a lot of discussion on noise complaints, because the expanded downtown area where you have, 6th Street, which is pretty loud. You see bars opening, and you would have still a lot of the old communities living there. So there was a lot of conflict when I was living in Austin about that. I would see that all the time. So that's where the idea is coming from, to talk about noise as this point of controversy. And I decided to do it in Brazil because I thought that there was a saturation of that cultural approach in Brazil. So, discussions of popular music and discussions on specific communities. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about the state, talk about governance, talk about how a city like São Paulo deals with this issue. And to be honest, I had no idea what kind of ethnography I would conduct in São Paulo. I just had this idea of noise is an interesting point of entry to understand the city and to understand governance. So the only thing I knew is that there was an anti-noise agency. Other cities didn't have an anti-noise agency. So I decided, okay, my first step is going to be to talk to this anti-noise agency and do an institutional ethnography. So I think, Jim and I were doing institutional ethnography, which can be challenging, can sometimes be boring, but I think it's a fresh field that deserves more attention. And I just spent time with them. I thought, maybe they would just say, "We're not interested in this study that you're conducting." But I think at that point, there was an interest from some of the local public officials in showing transparency. So transparency to a limit. And again, if you go to the performance metaphor, right, there's always a front stage and a backstage in the things that they show you, and in the things that they gently ask you not to mention, including, of course, corruption, including bars paying public officials who are supposed to fine the bars for being too loud, and bribing those officials. And that happened when I was there. And it's, I would say, an inevitable issue when dealing with urban noise. So the book is organized around the city of São Paulo as a government, a body of government. And I basically structured the book considering each governmental branch. So I talk about the legislative, then I talk about the executive power, and then I talk about the judiciary power. And I also talk about scientists. I also talk about experts, people, engineers, acousticians, people who are supposed to know a lot about noise, because there was an interesting discussion among the experts on how to measure noise. There was a discussion on the best way to measure noise. And what I found interesting is that the discussion was not just about scientific premises, but was an attempt to balance being scientifically accurate, but understanding the state's limited resources to deal with sound. So, you know, the anti-noise agency for a city like São Paulo with 11 million people, you have six engineers to measure sound. Now, in what world would you expect that they would be able to deal with that? But it's there, and it's used strategically. I think that's what I try to show in the book, sound and noise, because it's so heterogeneous. Traffic can be a noise, party, your neighbor can be a source of noise. So the state can also be a source of noise. And I try to show how the state, in different moments in the history of the city, try to use that very strategically to say, no, this is the problem. So let's go after the bars and leave the traffic alone. And of course, there's economic ramifications of that, right? In terms of the auto industry in Brazil. But ultimately, what I try to do in the book is to show how these different groups mobilize resources to give and to try to establish a certain definition of noise, and then how the state should use its instruments to deal with noise, and and excluding these other things that are kind of loud, but that shouldn't be a priority. So that kind of different priorities that you have when you're dealing with something like noise. And I show that among scientists and among lawmakers, within the anti-noise agency, within the police, and the judiciary with the judges, nobody, none of these groups, they have a clear, stabilized definition of what noise is and how to solve the problem of environmental noise. So it's not that the scientists have a clear sense of how to measure. Is a source of dispute. So that's what the book shows too, is this controversies within these groups and between those different actors. And I think last thing I will say is that I try to discuss, and one of the reasons I chose São Paulo is because it's a city very much attached to a certain notion of modernity, of progress. I would say with really strong racial connotations, and how São Paulo is very much dealing with this, what they call the two Brazils. Two Brazils, one attached to the colonial past, traditional, kind of backward, often Black, and the other, really attached to this notion of progress, and the state taking different positions depending on the administration and the time that you consider. That's what I try to show, how noise can be a framework to understand the state in the instrument of social analysis, ultimately. I think I'll stop here just to let others talk.
So I think the idea is that Jim will respond, and Leo respond to Jim's book, and then we can open up for some discussion with the audience.
Sure, that sounds good. Yeah, a good starting point that maybe for Leo and I, for us both to respond, is to dig in a little bit more on this figure of institutional performance and what it means for an institution to perform, to be studying the performance of an institution, and specifically the very bureaucratic institutions in this measure. I know from our previous conversations, we both, in pitching these projects to presses and in developing them, encountered some, what Leo called it a boring topic early on, and it's hardly boring, but it is, it isn't sexy on the face of it, right? To be reading a lot of old transcripts and kind of digging into the minutes of committee meetings and those sorts of things. So I'll talk a little bit about what it means for an institution to perform in my book, and then I'm going to throw it back to you, Leo, to get in a bit more. For me, an institution like the UN is at once an actor, a spectator, and a stage, right? It's a space in which performance happens, and that's its primary function. And this means that you both have live performance events happening, like a Security Council meeting, or a debate in the General Assembly, or say a speech given by a head of state. All of these things are instantly identifiable to someone who's talking about performance as performance. You have a live body speaking in front of an audience. You also have reams of documents that are produced, both in terms of the transcripts that capture that live performance as a document, and as a document that has a different sort of materiality that can do something else, and in a set of other instruments, more performative. I'm thinking of Security Council resolutions or General Assembly resolutions. And I use this word performative in the sense of J.L. Austin as something that enacts something or manifests something in the world, that does some work in the world. I use this figure of dramaturgy, which comes from theater. Dramaturgy being a way of kind of thinking about how things are organized on a stage, how what happens in theater connects to what happens outside of the world, but also very often a sort of cute phrase that's used to talk about what dramaturgy is it's about the transit from the page to the stage. It's about how we read a play and turn that into something enacted. And so it describes a specific relationship between bodies and texts. And that's also something that's happening at the UN, and that I'm very interested in tracing, and kind of a location of performance in what we're doing is seeing these bodies perform. They become transcripts, or perhaps they write a resolution, and then that mobilizes the choreographies of other bodies out in the field. A Security Council resolution mobilizes peacekeepers who have their particular choreographies, who are embodied in a particular way out in the world. And so each of these is a location where we can say the institution is performing, even deeply within the text as well. In my final chapter, I look closely at the negotiations in the General Assembly over a resolution on nuclear disarmament, and look at how the sort of negotiations on specific language in that resolution were a space in which these technocrats were performing, essentially. Often against one another. And that's sometimes a difficult thing to kind of conceptualize, but I think it's important to recognize that the performance is happening at all these different stages. With your book, Leo, I was really excited, to get into your chapter on administrative flows, where you're, tracing this other sort of bureaucratic performance and getting into a different set of dynamics on it. You talk about kind of the slowness of it, but also then where that bureaucratic performance can get jammed up or frustrated. So I mean, I'd love to hear more from your perspective about that side of institutional performance and how you see it as a salient figure in your own work.
So the way I got to performance was really different from Jim. I got to this notion of performance through actor theory, where you have the word actors, so you could expect the analysis to really pay attention to performance. But I had a notes on actor theory, but I think it's gonna distract the discussion too much. But one of the premises is that the social analysis should retrace how collection of heterogeneous actors relate to each other and mobilize resources to achieve a certain state of affairs. I know that sounds abstract, but that's what I was trying to do with this chapter on administrative flows. You have a noise ordinance, and the idea of performance is how to execute. So that's one layer, I think, of performance, is how do you execute the law? And I think in Latin America in general, and certainly in Brazil, this is such a convoluted act, convoluted performance, because in civil law tradition, you have the codes, and then you have to interpret the codes, and you have disputes on how to interpret the code. And just to give you a recent example, Supreme Court of Brazil this week, one justice decided that Lula should be free. And Lula is a former president of Brazil. He was incarcerated for about 500 days. And the justice 2 years later decides that, actually that investigation should not be conducted in this district. So let's just cancel all that and start again. So it's a really often frustrating process of performance. And what I did in that chapter of administrative flows is how you move from the paper, the law, the text, interpretations, to eventually getting rid of a noise. So each step you have to manage, and you have to mobilize a group of actors. And if there is any issue with one of those actors, so one actor in my case would be the sound pressure level meter, right? If there is a problem with that thing, then you cannot execute the law. And that's just one example of a long chain of things that are attached. If for some reason the police could not accompany the people making the measurement because they have to go with police security, right? Often they go into restaurants and bars at before 1 a.m. and it's not a very safe job. So the administrative flows is just looking at this performance in the sense of going from the text to what the text is proposing, the problem that the text is proposing to solve, which is environmental noise and definitions of noise. Now, my turn to ask you something.
Yeah, of course, throw it back.
So, I mean, throughout the book, you talk about this notion of interface,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems that you're trying to consider this relationship between performance and spectatorship through different angles. And you try to constantly destabilize this idea of what is a spectator, who is watching whom in that sense. Can you talk a bit about the concept? Is it something that you developed or that you are still working with, or is it specific to that kind of research project?
You know, I'm not trying on any particular theory of interface or interfaciality in the project. It's not, I wouldn't say that it's a sort of codified set of theory in the discipline, though you do hear people talk about it, or use the term or think of theater in terms of interface. You know, I think I'm not necessarily destabilizing the relationship between actor and spectator with the use of the word, but recognizing the power intrinsic to spectatorship, right? And to watching. So let's go back and think about how I'm using the term interface and why I'm using it. And I think there's a corollary here for thinking between our two books. You know, if your book with actor network theory is this zoomed out function looking at the whole, in these moments of interface, I'm looking at where your different nodes in a network might be meeting one another and encountering one another. So we can think about theater and what theater is in a wide variety of different ways. There's different ontologies of theater, definitions of theater, and certainly in like COVID times right now, a lot of those conversations are being reopened. Regardless, one way to talk about what is constitutive of theater would be to talk about liveness and talk about a live encounter between two individuals, between performer and an audience, right? Something happening in real time between these. And it's that figure of liveness that brings us to this sort of question of interfaciality when a performer engages with or encounters their spectators, right? And so theater is an interface in this sense that it's about this point of contact and encounter between, it could be between states, could be between an institution and individuals. Very often it's between people and power, right? It's the place where that sort of nebulous figure of the institution encounters its publics and even emplaces its publics. I think it's useful to think of theatricality and theater not just as implying spectators, but putting spectators into a particular place as an effort to kind of circumscribe the powers available to an audience and circumscribe them precisely because at that moment of interface, they have the power to push back. So it's a way of thinking about institutions as being somewhat more expansive than their ostensible boundaries. So in some cases, in my work on the ICC, right, it's not just thinking about the interface of the ICC being in The Hague, but also extending onto television screens with the television program Crossing Lines, which depicts this fictionalized version of the ICC that encounters audiences who then develop an image of what the ICC is, and that can impact policy in their own countries when they vote about what they think this thing is. Or when the ICC sets up a screen in the Ituri region of the Congo and live streams its proceedings to affected communities there as well. We're not in The Hague anymore, but The Hague has extended itself into the field in these ways and produced an interface where it meets a set of spectators who can push back and so on. So the interface indicates the permeability of these ostensibly monolithic institutions as well. Another place in my ICC chapter where I think about it is that chapter largely follows closely the trial of Jean-Pierre Bemba, who in the first few drafts of the book had been convicted by the ICC, and in the final draft he was unexpectedly acquitted. So some last minute revisions to that chapter happened. He was acquitted on appeal. Watching the video of his acquittal, of the proceeding when that acquittal is read aloud in court, is quite striking because the cameras in the ICC courtroom don't let you see the public galleries. They kind of keep them off stage in a lot of ways. But in the moment that the acquittal is read, the glass, soundproof glass barrier between the public galleries and the courtroom is permeated. You can hear the cheers of his supporters in the public galleries going up and kind of invading this space. So it's, you know, it's a small thing, but it's this clear sense that these barriers put up at the interface are not as soundproof, to use a you know, the figure of noise, as we might otherwise think of them. So yeah, that's how I use and think about interface, and why I'm interested in these moments of contact between institution and spectators.
So you would say that the interface affords the spectator to destabilize the meaning or the point of that event. Is that something that you mentioned, liveness in the interface? So that would be a kind of an opportunity for things to be shifted and to be, you know, often undermining the purpose of the meeting or the goal of that the people who organize that. Because you get the example you gave is like the judge could not even read the sentence, right? Because people were just so loud when he was acquitted that ended up undermining.
There's a misfire there. So we talk about performance, and I think I saw in the chat there was a question of symbolic action and symbolic expression as well. And very often, you know, we do think about performance on the world stage as being a performance of power, right? And so that authority needs to kind of perform its stability and perform its power. And when cracks appear in that, like that, I think is the sort of substantive place where we see a pushback, right? You know, where the institution in The Hague proves kind of perturbable by the audience watching in the gallery, right? That this kind of, you know, the figure of law, or the work law does, and maybe this is a way to get back into your book as well, is so often to kind of like to stabilize a set of events that are not stable because they're real things that happen out in the world. In your term, you know, you talked about the kind of like flexibility and voraciousness of law in your book as being able to like incorporate noise in all of these ways. And in my book at the ICC, it's about, you know, creating this historical record without any gaps that like ostensibly tells the story of the atrocity that happened, that stabilizes it for history, for a community, and so on, for better or worse. And what we see in the moments of live performance is that there is a sort of a vulnerability to that work, and a place where that work can be pushed back against. Yeah, and so that, you know, I'm curious how that figure of law might relate to the way that law appeared for you. Something that I was taken with in your book was this notion that the law is always kind of expanding to incorporate new sounds, new noises, right, and to take on these things that are exceeding it at various points. I was curious if there were any limits to that figure in your book, places where there were things that the law perhaps could not hear.
Yes, and I think I try to show that also in the chapter I discussed the municipal chamber. So the law is made by a group of people at a specific context, and they have specific interests. So whenever you have a noise ordinance being created, and you have a lot of other ordinances that never come into law, they're just bills, you can really see the ways that these groups and people lobby these groups, they are trying to frame an understanding of what noise is. So that is being reshuffled and renegotiated constantly. The definition of noise that the lawmakers are giving. And I think noise is an interesting paradigm, because the state is supposed to treat all noises equally. And that's something that the mayor used to say when the evangelical churches started to say, well, no, we're preaching, that should not be considered noise. And then they created a law that excluded their churches from any kind of law enforcement. And the mayor said, well, all the noises are equal. So the way we're going to figure out what is noise and what is not, and we're going to decide when to punish, is by decibel. If you go above a certain limit, that the scientists at the same time are constantly disagreeing, for instance, what that limit should be and how you should measure that. But once you pass that threshold, then it should be, we're going to treat it as noise, and we're going to treat it as a kind of an issue that the state needs to intervene, because it's a health issue, it's a public health issue. And I talk about different ways of understanding noise. It could be, if you're talking about community noise, it could be a way to prevent crime, because you have a lot of bars open till night. And if you use noise as a justification, nobody's gonna say we're targeting this communities, right? These poor communities, because we're saying it's about noise, but in fact, what we want to do is we want to prevent crime. We don't want people to drink and to have this fights in the middle of the night. We have a lot of robbery going on. So noise becomes this, either the object that you need to control, or it becomes the instrument through which you can control and deal with other social issues, right? From segregation to violence to public health, of course. So it opens up a lot of different opportunities for the state, because it's so unstable, it's so heterogeneous, that the state can move around it. And because it's not considered as something that is an emergency, it's urgent to deal with, it's relatively, you have complaints, people keep complaining, and it's not, that's, I think, one of the reasons why it's not really studied. But it's not like gun violence. It's not like homelessness. It's considered kind of a minor issue. But if you add, for instance, and I talk about the book, the kind of a zero tolerance premise, right? No, we need to control that, because that's going to lead to violence, right? The whole, like, Giuliani in New York, broken windows theory was really implemented in São Paulo in I would say in a relatively clumsy way. But I think that's one of the ways to understand is instability.
Can you expand a little bit on you touched on there something that you call in the book the noise culture axis. And what was interesting to me is that I felt like you complicated that axis, or made us think about the relationship there a bit more nuanced than we normally sort of do. There's a common critique of this axis that, like, noise is invoked as a way, or that framing a particular set of sounds as noise and associating those noises with like the uncultured or the uncivil, it's clearly carrying with it a set of racist, intolerant, ethnocentric assumptions. But I think as you kind of dug into that, it seemed that there was even more complexity there. Not to say that there weren't racist and ethnocentric assumptions going on in who was being accused of being the noisy party. But yeah, I mean, would you agree with that assessment? And can you expand on that a little bit about what we find when we look in that noise culture axis?
So sure, the axis thing is that's the conclusion. What I'm talking about, how these different groups, they establish a certain framework to understand that sound. And that's one of the reasons the book is not called Noise in São Paulo, things like that, because I'm also dealing with music and things that are people enjoy listening to. So I think it would be really an issue of stigmatizing that sound already by calling it noise, when I want the actors to give the definition that they want to give to talk about that sound. So I talk about the culture as being one axis where they frame. So you can talk about a lot of popular music genres to go back of the thing that I didn't want to write about. But samba was noise before it became a national symbol. It was treated as a kind of associated with black magic, because it is coming from Afro religion, for Brazilian religion sites of performance, but it was prohibited, and until the 30s. Tango, it was considered something that you need to push away and marginalize, and you don't deal with that. So a lot of this music, a lot of this sounds, especially sounds that require or that are traditionally happening in public space, you run through that kind of issue of, it's in the street, I don't want to hear, and I think the state should do something about it. And in Brazil and in the US and other places, public space is a place where the police can operate to bring order. So when I was doing the research, I would go to these community meetings, and that's exactly what the police officers would tell me. It's our duty, it's our responsibility, it's in the Constitution. We need to bring order and we need to bring peace. It's nothing against this music, it's just our prerogative. It's something that we are called on to do. So I think it's an interesting way to think about this notion of culture, because then you have groups talking about cultural rights. It's not noise what I'm doing, it's music, it's culture, it's art. So you have that shift in Brazil, and you have that shift in the US too. Early hip hop is an example of really marginalized and considered kind of a primitive music that has no harmony, right? It's just drums and bass. And a lot of it is about youth culture and youth taste. And there's a certain patronizing premise in Brazil, and here too, I think, about what the youth should do and what they should enjoy in their free time. And I think at that point, there was an issue of taking sound as an instrument to cross physical class and race boundaries in the city of São Paulo. So sound is a very powerful way to reach someone who is really far away and is a completely different economic status than you, but you have that powerful base. You can do a lot to annoy that group. So I think there was an issue of that noise and this loudness creating this kind of tensions. Sorry, that was a long response to it.
Oh, or invite them into the groove too, right? If they want to dance along with your noise. Yeah.
Right.
No, you think, in large part what my book is also about, and I think yours too, is thinking about this line between culture and society, or art and politics, right? And where we draw those lines, and how they impact one another. And I know in my own work, I see the line between diplomatic performance happening in a negotiation room and a play on a stage as being a spectrum, right? As being a connected. It's the same practice, but it's in different spaces and with different ends and to different goals. Like, so this notion that, for me, it comes down to this idea that art and politics are inseparable in both directions, right? That there's no art that doesn't constitute a political act in its own way, insofar as it's, impacting the world discursively and other ways too. And so too, the work of diplomacy always has more or less theatricality to it, the work of politics too. Yeah.
And it seems to me that the UN, they rely strategically on celebrities at various moments, and so they do you think they recognize that, or do you think they ideally would have those celebrities in very specific moments, but they want to keep the contrast between the celebrity, meaning bring people together,
Mhm.
And then at the same time, there is a moment for that, and there's a moment for serious decisions where the technocrats take over and there's no time for theatricality. Do you think they try to establish that division, or do you think it's...
They do, but they're also constantly blurring it, right? And there's a few, I mean, hearing you phrase the question that way, it makes me realize that there's a few moments I think that you were reading in my book that kind of point to that, right? The book opens by looking at debates in the Security Council over whether or not the British mission could host a production of Hamlet by the Globe Theatre in the Security Council chambers, right? And this, you know, is the question of like the frivolity of art and what it does and or doesn't do, becoming like an agenda item for the Security Council as Russia and China are saying, no, don't want that in the chamber. And you know, United Kingdom is saying, okay, why not? And this sense that, you know, there's both implicitly a power to that space and who you allow to perform in that space, and then also a sense that you know, that every negotiation is perhaps zero sum, that like you don't give an inch even to the artists. I think that if to just go back to performativity slightly, we're also seeing there like a recognition that art and politics both have the power to manifest worlds, right? You know, the sanctity of the Security Council as a space is that it's a space in which, you know, action on the world stage becomes legitimated, right? And so that's where, that's a very significant power that I think many world leaders kind of don't want to risk eroding to artists in some ways. So, but then there's other places too where like, as you point out, like the appearance of a celebrity can prove destabilizing, like in both directions. So, you know, there's I talk about Pharrell, the singer Pharrell, doing an appearance at an event for high school students in the General Assembly for it was on environmental themes, but around the time of Global Happiness Day, and that this event also like quickly descended into chaos as all the high school students rushed the stage to get selfies with Pharrell, and they had to shut down the event, right? Another simple moment in which the presence of celebrity kind of pricked this skein of order in the space that needed to be maintained at all costs. Or other points at which celebrities get kind of trotted out to do different work. So there's another moment when the International Criminal Court, its relationship with the UN is such that they're independent organs, but the prosecutor of the ICC gives regular briefings to the Security Council, and at these briefings, it's generally covering cases that were referred by the Security Council to the ICC, which is a small subset of cases, but included in them is Darfur and the ICC's investigations and proceedings related to Darfur. So an instance in which the ambassador from Sudan is speaking to the press outside of the chamber after Luis Moreno Ocampo, the ICC prosecutor, has given his briefing, and he had noticed that Mia Farrow had just been in the crowd, and he invokes her there as this like evidence that the Ocampo, everything he's doing is just for show. It's frivolous. It's the arts. It's so on. It's more of that pejorative invocation of theater. So you know, there's a.
It can play both ways to this kind of artificiality, or it can work to legitimize or to give a certain legitimacy. Like when DiCaprio becomes the ambassador of whatever, it gives a certain.
Right, and so, but I also think part of my argument is that there's something uncanny, you know, about seeing the professional performer, as you put it, alongside the diplomatic performer. That there's something in like when you see the two right next to each other, the diplomat realizes like the degree to which, or the politician or whomever, you know, realizes the theatricality of their own work and is made uncomfortable by that. When in fact, I think
also show that with C and the Ban Ki-moon. the general
Ah,
when
yeah,
he's trying to dance
yeah,
and
yeah, exactly. Gangnam Style, exactly. Yeah, this is
Gangnam Style.
side dancing Gangnam Style with the Secretary General, and there too it feels a bit uncanny. But that also, I think that's like a redeeming moment, because ultimately you see kind of a moment of candor there, where Ban Ki-moon kind of appears. Well, he starts to have a good time, right? And that can be a very affecting kind of thing to see on the world stage, is just two people having a good time. Should we maybe
Open up, I guess.
Yeah, let's open it up. We've been at this for an hour. Perhaps Emily, do you
Sandra
have
has lots of
questions,
questions.
or Leo, if you see any there, or I don't know what best way to do this is. There's a lot in the chat.
I think normally we invite people to put questions in chat or just to speak up. Either is fine, really.
Sure.
Question for Leo, what about the uses of noise as weaponry? Right, that's next book. There's always something that you can do. So yes, that's been a topic that sound study scholars have been studying. It's been a difficult topic because of access. I try to interview the CEO of the LRAD, the long range acoustic device, which is basically sonic cannons that they they're made to be used at sea for a ship to communicate with another ship, and they are using that on top of those police tanks today to disperse crowds. So it's really, really problematic how they're using that. My next book, one chapter is going to be about stun grenades in protests and how they're being used and abused. It's just an abuse of the use of so-called non-lethal, which is, of course, they often are lethal. And I think we saw that for sure with the post George Floyd events, how the police is being used as military weaponry in civilians. And Brazil is one of the global major players in this non-lethal weapon, and there's a reason for that. It's this long history of really using violence first. I didn't mention, but Brazil went through a military dictatorship. So the military police and the current president is a former army captain. So he's a long history of military understanding of how society should operate, that the military know what to do. And if we throw a stun grenade and you lost part of your hearing, that's because you're on the wrong place. So yeah, that's definitely something worth studying.
And actually, it intersects my work as well in my more recent work, because in the last few years, perhaps you followed a bit, there were these instances of American diplomatic workers coming down with a mysterious ailment in China, and Cuba, and other places. And for a while, it was suggested, and it's still debated, that it was a noise weapon being used to attack them. Ultimately, I think that what is going on there is there's still debate whether it's a form of collective hallucination or in fact was a noise weapon or other environmental attack of some sort. But it also, I think, in Leo's work and in my own, reminds us that to talk about like this continuum between arts, culture, and society, politics, we're also talking about violence, right? And that violence is part of this and is here. That along this continuum we are being like just as diplomacy makes its way into war, right? That there is violence deployed along the continuum, and either interpreted or abetted via the arts. Certainly in my case, looking at things, my first chapter again looks at the Security Council debates in the run-up to the war in Iraq in 2003, right? And thinking about how that performance, that theater in the Security Council was necessary to a powerful state, the US, in order to legitimate its use of violence and its use of force. And then also thinking, there's a question in the chat about what our studies, what their utility is for activist work on the other end, and for folks to push back. Following the debates, I also look at plays that kind of take and reinterpret those moments and try to rewrite that history. And I think that is the space in which our works are useful to activist projects, is thinking about how we make sense of the work these institutions do, frame it differently, and kind of impact discourse the same way they're impacting discourse. Discourse not as something separate from the material like events of the world, but as precisely that thing that makes the world that we live in.
I think Angie had her hand up earlier.
What?
My questions are in the chat. If there's live questions, it would be better to spend time, I think, on the questions of others. But thank you very much to both of you. I think I will just say, I think both of these, the work that both of you are doing is very strong. I think it will get stronger as you broaden the range of literatures with which you engage. I understand that you entered through the door of performance studies, but there's work in political science and all over the place. If you follow some of the leads in the chat, that will make it even stronger and broaden the range of your readerships.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Thanks for coming. Yeah, there's definitely for me at least, the homework of reading more political science, and because I do want to engage with them. I do want to bring them to a conversation on this notion of performance. I think it would be nice to see this kind of perspective. And it is, as you said, a large literature on state and use of power that has been really discussed. So yeah, definitely engage more with political science. That's something I want to do for sure.
And political science literature is actually foundational to a lot of what I'm working with as well. I didn't cite it as much or invoke it as much here. Going forward, my work on spectatorship and politics is working very closely with the political scientist Jeffrey Green's notion of ocular democracy, thinking about the place that spectatorship has sort of in our domestic politics as well. And there's a few other strands in political science following the same course. So I am engaging with that literature in some ways, and also in international relations literature, a lot of it coming out of critical theory. I'm thinking of the work of Kostas Konstantinou. His book On the Way to Diplomacy was kind of foundational for me in thinking about the relationship between theater and performance. And then finally, I think, you point to the literature on governmentality, and that was a whole area of discussion that Leo and I had planned to get to, but didn't quite get to, because Leo invokes biopolitics, and I draw heavily on Foucault's lectures on security, territory, population, and thinking about the work of international institutions as a form of global governmentality. And of course, there's a massive literature on that that we can get into as well.
Do you want to answer this?
Are there questions from the audience, or you want to take questions from chat, or?
Yeah, I think there are a few more in the chat. Multiple layers of spectators and spectatorship with different relations to the actual institutions and their performances when live. Are there then multiple layers of spectators? Do you see that, Jim? Are there multiple layers of spectators and spectatorship with different relations to the actual institutions and their performances when live?
Yes, absolutely. And they're at different removes to the sort of liveness of the event as well, right? That these things have an afterlife online. So of course, if we want to just be kind of like sketch it out directly in thinking about the dramaturgy, you have events in the UN or at the ICC have public galleries that are often filled, although the public galleries at the UN are no longer open to the public because in the early 90s, this is the story they tell at least, a protester chained himself to the galleries. And so they closed them to the public. But we do then have these online spaces. So tv.un.org streams all of their events live, and there you have another international audience arriving. I think, again, thinking about the ICC and the way that it approaches its audiences is interesting, because it has a different sort of, injunction or sense that, for justice to be done, it needs to be seen, right? And seen by as many as possible. So they do more to kind of cultivate audiences in the areas where they work. When I was doing my field work there, I recall walking down a hallway and seeing they had all these pictures of their field events that were just pictures of the backs of people's heads watching a screen where the local community was watching a live stream of proceedings and things like this. So the sense that like the audience itself had to be put on display in this way. Of course, there's all these sort of special events at the UN that engage different audiences. I talk about concerts that happen in the General Assembly, or events for high school students, or for other groups of diplomats and their families having these concerts. That this is another space. And of course, when I was doing my field work, I would end up at these things from time to time, or seeing the production of Hamlet in the GCHRBookChats chamber, where you're sitting with some journalists and some other like first secretaries, and then down in the front row are all the ambassadors watching the performance as well. Everybody lumped together as audience there. There's also, I'm especially interested in the book, in those places where diplomats become audiences to theater. One of my favorite case studies in the book is talking about Samantha Power organized a trip of Security Council members to go see the musical Fun Home on Broadway, a private showing, and have a talk back afterwards. And they're kind of seeing, again, these moments of candor coming out between the two. Yeah.
I don't want to ask a question, but this one I'm interested to. This distinction between common law and civil law. How would you situate the UN in terms of those traditions that are very different in terms of the conception of law and how law should be created and executed and interpreted? Do you have a sense? Because it's such an interesting.
Yeah, I don't have a sense as much for the ICC. I know for the UN, but the ICC, of course, is trying to establish its own sort of jurisprudence between these systems and between a variety of national systems. So, it's not, it has panels of 3 to 5 judges, and it's, can at times feel like an adversarial courtroom, and at other times feel like an investigation. And that produces some conflicts. Now, at the same time, in thinking about, kind of a truism when you read folks talking about international law or international relations more generally, is the sort of investment in the sense that it's a space of anarchy in the terms of international relations, or a space without precedence in the terms of international law, right? And so things can be built kind of from scratch in that space. I'm not a jurist, so I wouldn't be able to kind of give you a detailed sense of, okay, they're taking this from common law and this from civil law and so on. That there is an effort, and an interesting effort, to kind of navigate between these different systems.
Oh, there's a recent report confirming he's a realist.
I think that was within just the last couple of weeks.
That is a.
Oh,
are you writing about that, Jim?
I was before the pandemic hit and got put on hold. So,
is that the Cuban one? It
was in China, and there were a few other reports, and Yeah, I feel like I had heard the same things that Sandra, that you'd been hearing, the new.
The recent report dealt with across the multiple incidents over several years across multiple countries.
Yeah.
And then and talking about the brain damage, and which is very real, and so on.
Yeah. Oh, and I didn't mean to imply that any of, even if it, there was a quality, I used the word mass hallucination. That's real too. So, absolutely. But no, I need to revisit that work in relation to the next book. Right now, the project that I'm most focused on is an edited volume I'm working on with several authors that comes out of some conference proceedings that we had on theaters of public diplomacy, we called it. So a variety of authors that I'm working with who have chapters on sort of national performance on the world stage, thinking both about soft power, cultural diplomacy, and about the performance of diplomats and heads of state and so on, and thinking deeper about kind of the ways that power is formed and the ways that national communities sort of negotiated in these performances. There was a reference to Benedict Anderson and Imagined Communities, and that's, I think, a strong touch point for this, a touchstone for this work, is thinking about how community is articulated and disarticulated in performance, and of course that's part of Leo's book as well.
Would you like to carry on or take a last question, or we've lost some people, but we can carry on. It's all right. It's up to you, I think, really.
I think one more question maybe is a good way to go, if there's something that's really burning from our live audience.
If there isn't one, I was very keen on the question, how has the pandemic affected the actions and behaviors that you analyze in your books? Because that's, I think that's touching everyone's research, whether we actually write about it or not yet.
Sure.
If I could expand on that, what got me going down that path, James, was your mention of the not filming in the UN. For the first time in history, the US Supreme Court is live streaming. And I'm wondering if there were changing practices in the UN, and it must have made dramatic changes of multiple kinds for the subject matter that you write about in your book before all this started.
Yeah, and because so I'll yes, I know that they, unlike the Supreme Court, they were already using a lot of video conferencing and video teleconferencing in the UN, in the Security Council, and in the GA and so on. And now they're using those things almost sort of exclusively to bring folks in from afar. I think that it has led to some other conversations about who needs to be aware in the use of these spaces, right? The sanctity of the space as being the live space in which it happens is no longer quite as, the sort of constructedness of that figure is shown that way. Now at the ICC, and I haven't looked recently, as closely at how the pandemic has affected their work specifically, because the project has kind of moved away from some of these international arenas more recently. But I know, the question of the value of live testimony versus some sort of documentary evidence like film, video, or written archives documents is always a pressing question in that space. And there's always, it's a question, I think, in a variety of legal arenas around the world. So I'm thinking about, in my book, I talk about the trial of Thomas Lubanga, where they had live witnesses who recanted their testimony at some point, but he was still convicted on the basis of some video evidence that they had of recruiting and using child soldiers. And in the sort of opinions of the judges, you can see this debate going on between how well can we trust live testimony of an individual, how necessary is it for convicting, and so on. And I think that those questions are becoming perhaps, I would imagine that those questions would become more pointed in the present as well, as we're at these distances, is kind of the ways that we invest the live and the pre-recorded, or the fleshy and the digital with different values. Leo, for you?
So, I mean, yeah, just the pandemic hit São Paulo pretty badly. Was one of the most affected cities. And Brazil, as you know, is the global epicenter now of the pandemic. Almost 3,000 people dying a day now. And there is no end in sight. So one of I'm kind of working now on a project that I think it's more similar to Jim's book than my first book. I'm looking at Bolsonaro's public appearances and what effect that had in how the country has been understanding and dealing with this pandemic. So Jim's book is going to be a reference for me, kind of a speech act, more analysis of his rhetoric and his investment in undermining this until the end. It's very interesting. I think Trump at some point kind of changed a little bit his discourse, but Bolsonaro is just, there's no expectation that he's gonna say that you need mask and that you should get vaccinated. He's gonna, so I'm interested in that kind of new wave of populism that you have in the Latin American right. So in terms of the noise thing, you still have clandestine parties and still have noise issues, but it's just much less, I would say, than when I was doing my research. When I was doing my research, you would have about 300 parties in the streets every weekend, which is just impossible for the government to deal with because they move, they don't stay in the same spot. So now I think everything is in a break. I don't think the police, the public officers are actually finding bars because of noise. They might find the bars because they're open, but not due to. So it's easier. You don't need people measuring anything. It's just if you're open, you get a fine.
Well, I think that's a sad but fascinating place to perhaps close. So such a rich and fascinating discussion, I think, for all, and really exciting, I think, for the Glasscock Center, in the sense that we love having cross-disciplinary discussions, and this one was so clearly that, and really exciting to hear about your books. Congratulations to you both for them, and I think it was great also to hear a little bit more about what your new work is about. So I'll just, without further ado, just everyone join me in thanking you so much for.
Thank you, and I appreciate Emily the opportunity. I think it gave me a better sense of what my colleague is doing. I think it's a great opportunity to see the commonalities, and I think do this kind of events is very, very helpful for us.
Same on this end. Leo and I have often talked about connecting for something like this, and so we finally did it. It's great.
Well, we'll definitely see if we can do more of these two book chats, because it obviously seems to be working all around. So I think, yeah. Well, thank you again. Okay, and I'll hope to see you soon.
Yes, hopefully face to face.
Yeah, indeed. All right, take care all. Thank you.